Hello, welcome to Sabbath School with Branch Davidians. I'm Ed, and I'm here with my wife, Mary.
Hello, we're excited you're joining us today.
Yes, thanks for listening. We present or expound on a principle or belief related to the SDA Sabbath School Quarterly each week. This quarterly is entitled On Death, Dying, and the Future Hope. This week's lesson is entitled Christ's Victory Over Death. Friday's lesson reads, quote, Modern sentiment doesn't allow for something like the resurrection of Jesus. However, the historical evidence is so strong that even those that can't accept the reality of the resurrection are forced to admit that many people believed that they had seen the resurrected Jesus. Thus, much of anti-resurrection apologetics is the attempt to explain what could have caused all these different people to believe that they had seen the risen Christ. Some have argued that all the disciples hallucinated the resurrected Jesus. Others that Jesus hadn't really died, but only had swooned and then come back to life after he had been brought down from the cross. And when he reappeared, his followers thought that he had been raised from the dead. And, believe it or not, some have argued that Jesus had a twin brother whom the disciples mistook for the risen Christ. In other words, the historical evidence is so strong for Christ's resurrection that these are the kinds of arguments people concoct in order to try to dismiss it. With the resurrection itself so important, we should not be surprised by all the good reasons we have been given to believe it. Close quote, Sabbath School Quarterly Lesson, Friday, November 11th, 2022.
So why doesn't modern sentiment allow for something like the resurrection of Jesus? Clearly, as the lesson says, the historical evidence is strong enough that even those who don't believe Jesus rose from the dead tend to at least acknowledge that many people believed that they had seen the resurrected Jesus. The arguments made by anti-resurrection apologists in an attempt to explain what caused all these different people to believe they had seen the risen Christ just aren't sound. For example, hallucination could be sufficient to explain one individual believing they saw the resurrected Jesus, but hallucination is not a sufficient explanation for multiple people seeing the same thing at once. In material reality, groups of people do not have the exact same hallucination. And in the case of the risen Christ, not only did a group of people see Jesus alive after his crucifixion and death, but multiple different groups, as well as different individuals at different times and locations, all claim to see the risen Jesus. See 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8.
And the swooning and twin brother theories for the cause of so many people believing they saw the risen Christ likewise do not stand up to rigorous historical review. There is no way that James, Jesus' brother, one of those listed in 1 Corinthians 15, would mistake the risen Jesus for one of his own other brothers, even if he was a twin. So go back to the original question. Why does modern sentiment not allow for the resurrection?
Well, many believe that a resurrection is a supernatural event, and as such is beyond the bounds of historical investigation.
But do the earliest accounts of the resurrection paint it as a supernatural event?
To answer this question, let's first define what a supernatural event is. In this context, a supernatural event is an event that involves something non-physical, that is, beyond nature. Since the non-physical is beyond investigation by its very definition, we would agree that if the resurrection was a supernatural event, it is beyond historical investigation.
But again, let's ask, was Jesus' resurrection a supernatural event?
Since Jesus' resurrection is known to us, first and foremost from certain ancient texts, we can only answer this question by ascertaining what those texts say about that event. And when we read them carefully, we find that they describe the resurrection as a patently physical event. There is nothing supernatural in what they claim. Here's the list of the things these texts associate with the resurrection. First of all, we have Jesus' body. It's in Matthew 28:6, Matthew chapter 9-10, Luke 24, John 20, 14-30, and 1 Corinthians 15. Next, we have the angels. Matthew 28, 2-7, Mark 16, 4-7, Luke 24, 2-7, and John 20, 11-12. Next, we have God. 1 Corinthians 6:14, Hebrews 13:20, and 1 Peter 1:21. Then we have heaven. Luke 24:51, Acts 1, 9-10, Ephesians 4:10, and Hebrews 4:14.
People assume that the resurrection is supernatural because they assume that one or more of these things are non-physical, but actually all of them are described in the sources as physical. This is apparent from the following list of texts. Jesus' body, Matthew 28:9, Luke 24:36-43, John 20:24-29, 1 Corinthians 15, angels, Genesis 18, 1 through 8 with 19:1, Genesis 32:24 with Hosea 12:4, Numbers 22, 22 through 31, Judges 6, 11 through 22, Psalm 78, 23 through 25, Luke 1, 19, John 20, 12, Acts 6, 15, Revelation 8, 5 through 6, Revelation 7, 11, and then God, Genesis 1, 26 through 27, Exodus 33, 21 through 23, Exodus 24, 9 through 11, Ezekiel 1, Daniel 7, verse 9, Matthew 18, 10, Philippians 2, 5 and 6, Colossians 1, 15, and finally heaven, Psalm 11:4, Psalm 78, 23 through 25, Amos 9:6, Acts 7:56, Colossians 3:1, Ephesians 1:20, Hebrews 8:1, Hebrews 11:15 through 16, 1 Peter 1:4, Revelation 4:1 through 2, and Revelation 11:19. These scriptures reveal that the early Christ followers, like most Jews before them, didn't believe in a non-physical realm. They understood everything involved in the resurrection, including Jesus' body, God, angels, and heaven, the sky, to all be purely physical. See our studies on materialistic theism linked in the description.
Since the earliest records of Jesus' resurrection presented as a purely physical event, to exclude it from the realm of historical investigation on the supposition that it is supernatural would be unwarranted and incorrect. It is an event that is claimed by ancient sources to have happened in physical reality, and so it is within the realm of historical investigation.
Another argument that we should address is that Jesus' resurrection is statistically improbable. There are different versions of the argument. Some say it is improbable and therefore can't be accepted as historical, since history is about establishing what probably happened in the past. This version of the argument doesn't say people shouldn't believe in the resurrection, it just says one can't establish it using historical methods. Another version of the argument says the resurrection is statistically improbable, and therefore it probably isn't true, and people simply shouldn't believe it. In either case, the argument goes something like this. There have been so many billions of people in the history of the world, say 100 billion or so, and they all died without rising again. So, if Jesus rose from the dead, he'd be 1 out of 100 billion. 1 in 100 billion is a super small number, and so the reasoning goes that the chances Jesus actually rose from the dead is vanishingly small.
So, what's wrong with this argument? Well, lots of things. First of all, history doesn't work like this. Every historical event is a singular one-off event. You can't establish or falsify historical events by putting them in a category of similar events and running the numbers. History isn't statistics. The way history is supposed to work is that you consider hypotheses for what's happening in a given circumstance, and then you bring the relevant evidence to bear upon those hypotheses to see what stands and what falls. So that's one issue with the argument. It fails to actually do the work of testing the hypotheses by considering the relevant evidence.
The second problem is that it is a flawed way of using statistical probability. Stats are useful, but they have to be used correctly. One key principle in using them correctly is randomization. Let's say you know, for example, that 5% of Americans have cancer. This tells you that, on average, if you randomly select 100 Americans, 5 of them will probably have cancer and 95 of them probably won't. You could also say that any randomly selected American has a 5% chance of being someone with cancer. But this is where things get tricky, because all this tells you is that as a randomly selected American, there is a 5% chance they have cancer, but it doesn't tell you anything about their chances of having cancer as the individual they actually are. To know whether or not it's probable that this individual actually has cancer or not, you'd have to know a whole lot of relevant factors about them, like their age, genetics, lifestyle, and the list goes on. People often make a mistake of talking about statistical probabilities for an individual as if they were a randomly selected member of a group, when in reality, by talking about them as an individual, we've pulled out of the randomized group.
If I say Most vehicles have 4 tires, so the chances are good that a randomly chosen vehicle will have 4 tires. I think you'd agree that would be a fine use of probabilistic thinking. What if I say something like this? Most vehicles have 4 tires. A motorbike is a vehicle, so it probably has 4 tires. You can probably tell there's something wrong with this line of reasoning, and you'd be right. The problem is that by specifying motorbike, we've now introduced a new category that's a subcategory of vehicles. The statistics that apply to the broader category don't necessarily apply to the subcategory. While it may be true that most vehicles have 4 tires, it's not true that most motorbikes do. Introducing a new category means that we aren't dealing with a random member of the larger category, and we can't use statistics that apply to the larger category for this smaller group.
When you talk about a specific individual, it is poor reasoning to make inferences as to what must be the case for that person based on what is statistically probable when talking about a group that they are part of. For example, you can't tell what's probably true about Elon Musk by what is statistically true for most Americans, since Elon Musk isn't most Americans. Furthermore, Americans isn't the only group of which he is a member. He's also part of the category South Africans and men and humans and mammals, and the list goes on. Just because something is true of the vast majority of members of these classes doesn't mean it's true or even probably true of Elon Musk, or any particular individual for that matter. When talking about an individual, you have to consider the relevant facts that pertain to that individual.
A good way to remember this is what we might call the furry feet fallacy. It goes like this. Most mammals have fur. You're a mammal, therefore you probably have furry feet. Obviously, arguing that you probably have furry feet just because you're a mammal is ridiculous, and it's making the exact same mistake we've been describing. It takes what's true for most of a group, and then it infers what's probable for a specific member of the group, when that person isn't randomly selected. They've actually been specified to the point we aren't talking about them as a random group member, but as an individual.
Arguing that Jesus probably wasn't resurrected just because he's a human and most humans haven't been resurrected is just as fallacious as arguing that you probably have furry feet just because you're a mammal and most mammals have furry feet. The logic just doesn't follow.
The only way to know if Jesus really rose from the dead is to consider all the actual evidence, and when we rigorously consider all the evidence pertaining to Jesus' resurrection, including the multiple resurrection appearances to individuals and to groups, the only hypothesis that proves to be both sufficient and necessary to explain the evidence is that they did actually encounter the risen Jesus.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. We invite you to visit our website, www.bdsda.com, to learn more about who we are and, just as important, who we are not. Please join us each week as we will continue to offer new and interesting insights for your Sabbath School studies.
And if you want to keep up with our new studies as they're published, we recommend subscribing. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on plenty of other podcast apps. Links for subscribing are in the description.
God bless.
Many blessings.